Dear friends, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I would like to recognize in the distinguished public that joins us today, Dr. Kevin Casas, a former Vice President of Costa Rica, and Mr. Francisco Chacon, a foreign minister and congressman of Costa Rica. Very good. For the first time in years, trade has been at the centerpiece of political debate in Washington. And much more so than many issues in Congress, the debate over trade has been very dramatic and unpredictable, to say the least. In mid-June, a large lineup of Democrats in the House appeared to kill President Obama's ability to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would be the most significant U.S. trade agreement since NAFTA. But then, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, TPP jolted back to life this week. Defying all predictions, both houses of Congress have now granted President Obama the fast-track authority he needs to complete the trade agreement. That makes it extremely likely that America will soon join a huge free trade agreement spanning 12 countries across the Pacific Rim, encompassing 40% of the global economy. Still, there is increasing domestic opposition to free trade. The Democratic Party and its brotherly assembly of trade unions have largely turned against it. And even Hillary Clinton, formerly an ardent free trader, has hinted that she opposes the TPP. Many Democrats now view President Clinton's signature trade initiative to have been the NAFTA as a disaster. It was only because of the support of some Republicans that President Obama's Trade Promotion Authority was able to pass Congress. Meanwhile, there is much debate how important is trade to the global economy, and in unprecedented shift, global GDP is now growing at a faster rate than global trade. So just how important is trade to the global economy will be a problem if countries turn more inward. What effects will increased or decreased trade have on the world? To help piece together these complicated issues, we are fortunate to have a superb team of experts. I would like to thank them very much for coming. First is our keynote speaker, former White House Chief of Staff, Mac McLarty. Mr. McLarty, who served under President Bill Clinton, is a trade expert who played an integral role in the passage of NAFTA and served as the President's Special Envoy to the Americas. He is currently the chairman of McLarty Associates. It would be hard to imagine a person as well suited to address this topic as Mr. McLarty. Personally, I must add that I owe Mr. McLarty a debt of gratitude. He was extremely kind and helpful to me in my initial steps here as an ambassador back in the 90s. Mr. McLarty will present us with a keynote address. However, I would like to present now our two speakers. One is Don Armando González, Chief Editor of La Nación, the leading newspaper in Costa Rica. Mr. González is actually my boss at the newspaper for which I've been writing since 1982, so I have to behave today. We're also joined by Evan Ellis, a professor of Latin American Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. He's a star speaker on free trade and a good friend of Hudson for many, many years. Thank you again for coming, and thanks again to our distinguished guests for joining us. We begin the keynote presentation of Mr. McClarty.
Good afternoon to our distinguished guests and to everyone who's taken time to join us. Thank you very much. Jaime, thank you for your very warm and personal words. I appreciate the opportunity to be at the Hudson Institute today. It's a venerable and respected organization that for many years has played an important role, not only working to set, but also implement the policy agenda. And I am particularly pleased to be with such distinguished panelists, with Armando Gonzalez and Evan Ellis. They both have written and spoken in such a serious and thoughtful and depthful way, and I'm looking forward, after my brief remarks, to being part of a panel discussion. It's always a real treat to join a good friend of long standing. Ambassador Darren Bloom has been an important voice, conscience across the hemisphere, both in his home country of Costa Rica as well as in our country. I think we first got to know each other in 1997 when I traveled to Costa Rica for President Clinton's visit there, which really exceeded expectations in many ways. You were advisor to a presidential candidate at the time, and it set the stage really for the CAFTA-DR trade bill that passed later, and that speaks to sustained engagement and how important that is from the White House and our country on issues. But we really got to know Jaime and his wonderful and elegant wife, Gina, because we were next-door neighbors for many years in the Calorama area. And we shared so many good times and some sad times together. We developed a friendship, a level of trust that is still very meaningful to this day. Now, Jaime, I must tell you that, one, we were able to overcome Harry Truman's famous quip about friends and dogs in Washington, and we established an enduring friendship. But as I was commenting earlier, one quick anecdote: we had President Clinton in our home for an event that was closed to the White House press. This was in the final year of his presidency. And there were about 25 members of the White House press corps that were following the president that evening, making multiple stops. So this was a dilemma. What were we going to do with the press corps during the hour plus that the president was going to be in our home? So I approached Jaime and I said, Jaime, could we possibly use your and Gina's residence? And Jaime, with that twinkle in his eye, said, oh, we'll be glad to do it. He said, now, Mac, do you want me to take them to the basement and lock them in? Or do you want me to greet them with a warm Latin American hand of hospitality and give them refreshments and food? I was tempted for a moment, I must tell you. But of course I chose the latter, and I'll always be grateful for that. So it's a pleasure to be here today with Jaime and his colleagues and all of you. The programs that Ambassador Darren Bloom runs here at the Hudson Institute are provocative, they're timely, they make us think, and I certainly can think of no other subject that fits that criteria and framework better than trade. Trade can be controversial, as we've seen. We have had a roller coaster-like ride on the Trade Promotion Authority, as Jaime noted. And I must say that I kind of feel like Harry Truman, because the original invitation, Jaime, said the apparent defeat of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so the invitation had to be revised, and it was for good reason. And it may, I hope you don't have to revise it again after these remarks. But it has been a roller coaster ride, and it suggests how complicated that trade can be. It's become kind of a four-letter word sometimes in Washington. But despite all of that, I am a pro-trade, centrist Democrat. I have strongly believed in bipartisanship and had the great privilege to work with President Bush 41 during his time as president as a leading business executive, not in the White House administration officially. But I believe that compromise is not a dirty word, and we should work toward principal compromise whenever possible. And I have consistently supported and fought for expanded trade broadly, and more specifically in the Western Hemisphere. Trade expansion is a commitment that I maintain because, to me, trade expansion has proven to be a very valuable and effective element and tool for the United States and for our trading partners in the hemisphere and beyond. Trade and good, sensible trade agreements develop, establish, and solidify the rules of the road, the rules of the game. And those good agreements are largely consistent with our interest here in this country and our values, and I would submit the interest and values of our neighbors in the hemisphere. Trade opens markets, and it keeps them open even when there are political temptations otherwise. It helps build capital, technology, management, and best practices, in addition to the exchanges of goods and services. And I think trade clearly creates efficiencies and lowers cost and builds consumer well-being. And it promotes the sort of continued economic and commercial contact that strengthens democratic governance. And at the bottom line, I think trade is a reflection of the world we are living in reality. All of you understand how interconnected our world has become, both in terms of communication, in terms of capital flows, in terms of ideas, in terms of trade. So I am very pleased, and yes, I am relieved that TPA is trending favorably. And of course, we'll be following, like all of you, closely the TAA debate. Leader Pelosi's statements were certainly encouraging. But having said that, as one of the newspapers captured today, there are fierce battles ahead. So we don't need to get ahead of ourselves in terms of this being a certainty, although I agree with Jaime's assessment, as I usually do, that there is a favorable trend line. It does take a difficult, grinding, one vote at a time slog, requiring unwavering resolve and purpose, and it certainly involves the strong leadership of the President and the White House to get a trade agreement accomplished. I'll never forget riding in from Andrews with President Clinton, and I raised with him during our drive time, Mr. President, we need to go forward with the NAFTA. And the President, in an unusual way, kind of turned and was a bit terse, which he normally was never with me. He said, Mac, I've told you I'm ready to do this 3 times. Why are you asking me again? I said, Mr. President, I just wanted to be absolutely positively sure you were ready to move forward. Because on any trade agreement, there's always voices both within any administration, Democrat or Republican, and certainly differing voices in the Congress. And as Chief of Staff, I wanted to make absolutely positively certain that I had a clear understanding with my President, which of course we did. But I've also learned, I think, with having spent a lifetime in politics, that many times the most consequential actions and decisions are sometimes, as you know from your public service, the most difficult. The Trade Promotion Authority will allow the President to conclude the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations with our partners in North America, South America, Oceania, and East Asia. And he will also be able then to rapidly advance negotiations to conclude an agreement with our European partners. That is a wide and sweeping agreement, as Ambassador Darren Bloom noted. But to this audience, I would note and respectfully submit that the implications of U.S. policy regarding the trade agreement, which I'm sure Armando and Evan will speak to, are also critically important. In the first instance, TPA will give both our friends and competitors the clear signal that the United States aims to remain a leader in the vision of open market economies. This is critical. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the global economy. Fair or not, there is some perception the United States is retreating from the hemisphere. We've all heard this. I really don't see it that way. I see Vice President Biden very engaged in the Caribbean, in Central America. I see Secretary Kerry, despite the enormous responsibilities and challenges he has, be engaged in the region. Secretary Pritzker has particularly been a strong voice with Mexico and beyond. Secretary Moniz, who is married to a wonderful Brazilian PhD, has been very active in his discussions with Brazil regarding energy and the environment. So I see a pretty broad-gauged effort by the administration. But having said that, there's no way better to convince others of our leadership than to exercise it. Because if we're not expanding trade in the hemisphere, other formal agreements are going forward with or without the United States. But as I noted, these agreements strengthen and solidify relationships, and the real kicker is then we have the ability to be at the table, to shape and mold and reach final agreement on these discussions. If not, they proceed without us. And these things matter not just in Asia and Europe, but in the region, as I noted. And NAFTA is a good example of that. NAFTA was passed in 1994. That was 10 years before Facebook was launched. Email was new, believe it or not, and the only social media at that time was the telephone, a landline, that is. So my point is that technology has fundamentally altered our lives. Think about a car you would have bought in 1994 and think about buying a vehicle today and the difference in technology. Think about what a difference that horizontal drilling has made in terms of our energy supply, where the North American continent has become a real source of supply as opposed to the scarcity that we once had. I could suggest many other examples, and so could you. So my point is that TPA will allow us to update the North American Free Trade Agreement, which we need to do, and bring this agreement forward into this century. I think that will be beneficial not only to the United States, Mexico, and Canada, but also to Chile and Peru. And it will help eventually bring in nations like Costa Rica, like Colombia and Panama, into an emerging Pacific region and the Pacific Alliance, which I think is quite an important development. What I'm trying to say is that the TPP will provide the opportunity to build a broader free trade area, maybe not in a formal way, but it will be a catalyst to revitalize trade within the region. And in that regard, I certainly hope that it will catalyze the relationship with Brazil, and I believe it will. President Rousseff comes to the United States next week. There's no question that trade, investment, commerce will be on the agenda between Xi and President Obama. I'll have the opportunity to be with Minister Montero, whom I visited with before, as well as President Rousseff at our luncheon with Vice President Biden. I think it is a promising time for Brazil and America to meet at the highest levels. You know, we don't think about the hemisphere quite in the same strategic way that we did in the Cold War. But yet, if we stop to think about it, nations still use their foreign policy and economic interest to promote their own interest. And there's no better practitioner of this these days than China. When I was in the White House in the 1990s, it was thought that our chief Asian competitor was Japan. China was in a different place, just beginning their long economic march, without much profile in Latin America and the Caribbean. But China has entered into the hemisphere with breathtaking speed and critical mass. China is now Brazil's top trading partner. That's the same for Chile and Peru. It's the second largest trading partner for Argentina and Cuba. It's building links with Colombia. And of course, China has offered support to Ecuador, Venezuela, and several Caribbean countries. Now, from my view, these emerging relationships are remaking, or at least reshaping, the Western Hemisphere. And in many ways, I would say that it's on balance positive that that's the case. Economic investment creates jobs. It helps buffer economic downturns. Additionally, China has capital to invest in excess capacity to employ. But I also strongly believe that it is important that these expanding links, as they move forward, are consistent with our regional interest and values, not just the United States, but the countries within the hemisphere. And particularly, Armando, you can certainly appreciate this in terms of transparency, the rule of law, labor rights, and the environment. Those are critical. So what it really means is the United States is facing more competition in the region. I think we'll be able to meet that competition and get our market share, get our fair share, but only if we are engaged and at the table to do so. Otherwise, I think we let a natural market move away from us, and that is not a good thing for the citizens of our country. I would also say we need to include Canada and Mexico to join the TTIP negotiations. After all, they already have free trade agreements with many of the countries that are going to be involved in those discussions. And the same would be in terms of Chile, Peru, and others. And I'd like to take one more step forward, and that is to have a race to the top, so to speak, to bring up the standards of existing trade agreements if the Trans-Pacific Partnership is concluded. I think it's an opportunity to do that, and I think it will be an excellent harmonization. Finally, and Jaime alluded to it, despite all of the encouraging news in the last 3 days, there's clearly strongly held views on the other side of the equation of trade. Many are sincerely, deeply, and emotionally held. I understand that, and I respect that. There may be a lot of other factors involved, as there usually are in any political vote or calculation. But if you take a step back, there's also a Pew poll, which is a very credible poll that shows 58% of the people in our country basically believe agreements with other nations are favorable. So what it likely suggests, as many of you know who have been involved in the political process, voices on the left and the right are loud and shrill, strongly held views that are shaping the debate. We could get into talk about how campaigns are financed, but that's for another day. But I think if you look at the overwhelming data, it suggests there is a large and growing support and understanding that trading with other countries, engaging with other countries, reflects reality, as I noted earlier. And I think it's particularly noteworthy that it's 69% favorable with millennials and 71% favorable with Hispanics. And that's going to be a key voter constituency in this upcoming election. And it just stands to reason if you're engaged in Latin America, that should help with those two groups, particularly with Hispanics. So to close, and as we move into our panel discussion, to be strong abroad, we've got to be strong at home. But to remain strong at home, I would respectfully submit for your consideration, we've got to be engaged abroad. Trade and international engagement on a bipartisan basis have made the United States strong. And trade with our natural partners in the Western Hemisphere has built a stronger, largely more democratic, and a more vibrant hemisphere than otherwise would be the case. It's not easy, it's not non-controversial. In fact, it's hard work. But it's the right thing to do. In my judgment, it is time for us to move forward. Jaime, it's been a pleasure to join you today at Hudson. I look forward to our discussion with Armando and Evan. Thank you very much.
That was a very enlightening presentation, and I always take very seriously what Max says. Now, I'm pleased to turn the podium to Mr. Armando Gonzalez, whom I omitted mentioning in his CV, that he did his graduate studies in journalism at Columbia University not too long ago.
Thank you very much. Thank you for allowing me to address you on this issue, which is of vital importance to my country as it is to yours. I am a journalist, and I do hope my remarks are satisfactory to Ambassador Darren Bloom, lest I be locked in the basement after this. I bring you a Central American perspective. And why would this be relevant at a moment when you are discussing a trade agreement with a much larger portion of the world and that reaches into deep into the Pacific? Well, I think it's relevant because I can't help witnessing the discussion that is going on today to recall the CAFTA negotiations. Many of the same arguments, many of the same myths, and even some of the same participants appear in the current discussion. So I think there is a link between our experience in Central America and what is going on in the US today. I have to recall an anecdote in Costa Rica, we couldn't agree on passing CAFTA. Our Congress was deadlocked. There were several procedural resources that were being employed to postpone votes. We couldn't come to a decision. So eventually, what the government did was said, okay, we will use a referendum, which is a constitutionally established possibility in Costa Rica. We will use a referendum to see if there's a yes or no on CAFTA. So we went to a referendum, and it was a political campaign, a full-fledged political campaign, okay? And the yes took it by 3 points, was it? By 3 points. That's how close it came, okay? The no was highly nurtured by myths, by some of the myths that are resurfacing in this Trans-Pacific debate. And the proof of this is that the next elections, the next national elections, okay, the no parties got a very small minority of the national vote, which basically indicated that people were voting no on CAFTA because they were afraid, scared by those myths. We had, in the final days of that whole debate, we had a visit by two distinguished U.S. legislators who arrived in Costa Rica. They were invited by the no faction to tell people in Costa Rica how terrible CAFTA would be for our country. When Congressman Michael Michaud and Senator Bernie Sanders arrived in Costa Rica and met with the press and addressed the problems that CAFTA would eventually produce, not a word was spoken about losing U.S. jobs. They spoke not a word in Costa Rica about the loss of U.S. jobs, because it would be a hard sell to tell Costa Ricans, the reason I oppose this is because I fear the jobs will come down here. Okay, that would be a big plus for the yes in Costa Rica. But not a word was spoken about that. However, many words were spoken about terrible consequences for our country. Can anyone believe that free trade will produce a lose-lose situation. There will be losses for all. I oppose free trade in the United States because we're going to lose jobs to you Costa Ricans. But those jobs that you Costa Ricans are going to gain are not really a gain because you're going to lose all of these other things. And that's what they actually came to preach, that it was a lose-lose proposition. That didn't make sense, so it didn't fly. What we did was we went into their pages on the internet and looked up the reasons why they opposed CAFTA here and published them there, and their visit backfired. Okay? So this argumentation that goes both ways, that warns all parties of the terrible consequences of free trade, can obviously not be sustained because it's incoherent. Free trade is actually a win-win situation. Yes, with adjustments along the way, because that is the whole idea. The whole idea is to take advantage of the comparative advantages each party has, and thus create riches for all. Legislative standardization was also an issue. And it is an issue now, as you discuss the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In Costa Rica, it so happens that some of our labor laws are more advantageous to workers than yours, for example. So we had no problem with accepting the standards that CAFTA has, because ours are even higher. But what the no did was say, as in, to some degree is being said today with the Trans-Pacific, is that the adjustment of internal laws would be such that many of our labor protections would be standardized to the bottom, low. They would be lowered. And so it was said, in Costa Rica every worker has the right to a 13th month of pay every year. Well, that was going to disappear. You remember the aguinaldo was going to disappear. Our very advanced labor law, the Código de Trabajo, was going to be overruled by some sort of international legislation. It was going to be displaced. Well, I was paid my 13th month on December, and I hope to be paid that much this next December again. And we still have exactly the same labor laws that we had before, with additions that have made them better. So legislative standardization, yes, it is an issue that was brought up then, and it is being brought up now. Our labor laws are still in effect, and our Social Security system is far from going broke due to the price of medicines. Now, does that sound familiar? Because it is an issue that has again come up. Back then, when we negotiated CAFTA, the no said that intellectual property protection would cause, in effect, our Social Security system to go broke because the price of medicine would be such that we would not be able to meet it. Our Social Security is far from being broke many years after we entered the agreement. It is still there. And if there is any financial menace to it, is because of internal structural factors that have to do with tremendous entitlements and salaries that are exorbitant in comparison to our market, all of which have been put in place basically by the influence of the people who were on the side of no at that time. But medicine and intellectual property, no. They are not threatening our Social Security system. Labor laws are in place. The Social Security is not going broke because of the price of medicines. You, the U.S., have yet to steal our water, drill holes in our continental platform to extract its riches with no consideration for the environment, establish an arms industry in our peaceful nation, or trade in human organs. Yeah. In the United States, Congressman Michaud discredited CAFTA by pointing out the limitations of our markets. They are small, he said, and therefore there was really no new opportunity for U.S. trade. Last year, the U.S. exported to CAFTA-DR countries $31.1 billion and imported $28.4 billion, with a positive trade balance to the U.S. of $2.75 billion. We're going to have to work on that. Total commerce with our modest market reached $59.5 billion. Whether you feel those numbers are significant or not, the U.S. would be remiss if it were to judge trade agreements solely on the numbers. There are also important strategic interests, and this brings me back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The well-respected economist Paul Krugman was quoted as saying he would be undismayed and even a bit relieved if the TPP just fades away. The problem is, it will not. The process began in 2005 as a trade agreement between Chile, New Zealand, Brunei, and Singapore, without U.S. participation. 7 other nations are actively negotiating, and 4 have announced their interest. If one looks at the map, the agreement would encompass the enormity of our Pacific coast from the Strait of Magellan to Alaska, with the small interruption of the Ecuadorian coast and the shores of Central America for the time being, because the agreement is being negotiated with an open model which will allow other nations to join in the future. That's a lot of coast and a lot of beaches. The deal belongs to the Americas as much as it does to other nations in the Pacific. In its current state, the Trans-Pacific Partnership nations represent an annual GDP of 28 trillion. Roughly 40% of global GDP, as Ambassador Darren Bloom pointed out, and 1/3 of world trade. It is also the fastest growing region of the world. The U.S. has the opportunity to participate in shaping the agreement and integrating its economy into this vast market. China has reacted to the Trans-Pacific Partnership by stepping up negotiations with other Asian and American nations, and here is where Central American, where a Central American or maybe a Latin American perspective may also be useful. China is pressing for trade deals throughout Latin America, as well as in Asia. Costa Rica is no exception. It is also investing in strategic areas of our economies and understands the importance of a detailed legal framework to those investments. Where is China investing in Costa Rica? Telecommunications. They want to invest in ports, but they were beaten by the Dutch to a large mega project. They are investing in infrastructure. They are investing in, there is the intention of putting together a refinery, an oil refinery. So they're all investments in very strategic areas. And they are not waiting for the free trade agreement that we have already signed and is up for ratification to go through. They are making these investments and they're pushing these deals before even that trade agreement goes through, but they are pushing for the trade agreement. Intra-regional trade deals are also springing up with no U.S. participation. The Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, inspired by former Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, has 11 signatories. Mercosur, the South American Common Market, encompasses 5 nations, and there are 221 free trade agreements in effect or in the works in Asia, including 114 that are already concluded. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, with 10 members, has free trade agreements with China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, with the noticeable exclusion of, yes, the United States. The New York Times quoted Shunpei Takemori, a Japanese university professor, in the sense that China is pushing, and if the US just stands aside, it would be a tragedy. That quote presents the case very bluntly. Therefore, the question we have to answer is not the first one posed in the invitation to this event, which is the potential decline of free trade. The question, rather, is if the United States is willing to participate, because no, it won't fade away. Thank you.
I would like to turn the podium now to Dr. Evangelis. After Dr. Ellis's presentation, we'll open a space for questions and comments. Evan?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Darrenblum. I want to thank Ambassador Darrenblum and the Hudson Institute for the opportunity to be part of this very distinguished group today. It's quite an honor to be able to share a podium with Mac McClarty, as well as with Armando Gonzalez, and also to have your interest here today. That's very good turnout. What I would like to do is to take a strategic look at what the TPP and some of the other trade initiatives that we're seeing across the Pacific mean from the perspective of the United States and Latin America. So I'm going to broaden the comments out just a bit. At the same time, obviously it's difficult coming from my own position within the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College. As many of you know, there's a official requirement that all DoD personnel must bring PowerPoint to any presentation that we give. But it wasn't long ago, just about 2 months ago, that our new Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter, made a rather interesting statement about the importance of the TPP, that the TPP was important as another aircraft carrier. Although a lot of interesting things have been said about the TPP, what grabbed me about that statement by a very distinguished person who is not oriented towards hyperbole is the connection that he made between this largely economic issue and the strategic interest of the United States. And in a broader interest, what TPP and many other agreements are about is not just economics, but about the position of the United States and the prosperity of like-minded countries in this new, as of yet new, 21st century. As we look at the Pacific, oftentimes we talk about the pivot to Asia or China or Asian countries. And what we forget is that the Pacific is not just Asia. The Pacific is also Canada, the Pacific is Costa Rica, the Pacific is Chile, the Pacific is Mexico, etc. Oftentimes when we make policy towards the Pacific, we forget one complete side of the Pacific. And so I was very welcome to see the Central American perspective provided by Armando Gonzalez as well. And also, as was alluded by both of the speakers, the TPP was only one of many different alternative possibilities of what the emerging regime of the Pacific might look like in the 21st century. The Chinese, when they hosted the APEC Leaders Summit in Beijing just a few months ago, put forward a alternative, kind of a TPP light, if you will, somewhat more strategically oriented towards the Chinese way of looking at trade, something called the Free Trade Area of the Asia Pacific, which I'm told still lingers with life as an alternative if TPP does not go through. There are other things apart from trade agreements. For example, the fact that China, as it engages with the nations, basically of CELAC, basically the region excluding the United States and Canada, is pursuing a way of engaging that basically excludes the U.S. and Canada and the established inter-American system and the OAS from that way of doing business across the Pacific. And so what I come down to is what I want to plant as my fundamental point here today: the importance for the U.S. and like-minded nations of defining a regime of not only formal rules, but also informal practices in which we all can live and have the opportunity not only to prosper, but to reap the benefits of our own good, or less good as they may be at times, policies. In doing so, it's important that we craft such a regime of both formal and informal rules, considering not just the Asian side of the Pacific, but our counterparts in the Latin American and the Canadian, basically this side of the Pacific as well. So as we talk about that, and thus the importance of making sure that that regime is one that is dominated by things such as rule of law, free trade, the protection of intellectual property, and democratic governance, things that which explicitly the TPP seeks to raise standards in, but the TPP is only the beginning in that. What we also can recognize is that within the Latin American side, and I'm going to focus very much on the Latin American side just because it gets such short shrift when we talk about the regime of the Pacific. But when we focus on Latin America, what we really see is a new debate that is emerging. And it's a debate that is recognizable in terms of the 20th century and yet different because it's something that's coming from the Americas itself. On the one side, loosely you find the U.S., Canada, and the nations of the Pacific Alliance taking a position that advocates free markets, a model of engagement based in strengthening the rule of law, achieving efficiencies within their trade and other structures, within their logistic structures, finding ways to achieve synergies between the nations, not only in terms of physical good flows, but also intellectual property, in terms of the flow of ideas and personnel. On the other side, without prematurely bemoaning organizations such as ALBA or the models pursued by Argentina and Brazil, and recognizing the diversity within those organizations, it's fair to say that all of those models basically put greater emphasis on the role of the state. The role of the state not in necessarily advancing commerce, but brokering commerce. Not in achieving access to markets, but regulating access to the markets in the name of a subset of their people. The interest of the state in redressing inequalities rather than necessarily a focus in expanding the pie for all. So the interesting thing about this is there is not, as we saw in the 1960s and 70s in Latin America, a deep disagreement about whether to do business with Asia, but there is a fundamental divide emerging in the region about how to do business with Asia. And my point here, and the point that I would like to take forward for U.S. policymakers and others, is that the way that debate turns out has fundamental implications for the future of the United States and like-minded countries. Having said that, and I'm not going to dwell too much on the details given the amount of time that we have and in the interest of asking questions, but on the Pacific Alliance side, obviously, as many of you know, there has been rapid progress, the achievement of an integrated market, financial markets through the MILA mechanism and things such as that, and future plans to do even more with respect to greater flows and interchanges in terms of universities and intellectual capital. At the same time, we've seen some progress. There was actually just the ratification of a free trade agreement between Panama and Mexico, which may pave the way for Panama to be the next entry into the organization formally, although that's still a bit up in the air. There's been a lot of interest in terms of observer states, and yet I am also worried about the future of the ideas represented. 1 week from today, the leaders of the Pacific Alliance countries will meet in beautiful Paracas, Peru, as Peru takes the presidency pro tem of the Pacific Alliance. And yet, I've sensed, if we look back at Punta Mita, Mexico, the last Pacific Alliance meeting, and as we look toward what seems to be on the agenda for the current one, a certain loss of momentum. And that momentum, there are some smaller issues. There was a ruling by a constitutional court in Colombia, which indicated that Colombia's way in entering the alliance had been unconstitutional. And while my Colombian colleagues assure me that it's just a small detail, it's one that has not yet been fully addressed. Similarly, the very credible current government of Costa Rica has been perhaps less than enthusiastic about pursuing free trade. And indeed, the loss of its legislative majority has also created some difficulties in streamlining the laws that must be streamlined by which Costa Rica moves from becoming an observer to the alliance into being a full-fledged member. Also, of course, there is significant distraction across the members of the alliance. It's a bit of a perfect storm. We have the resignation of the cabinet of President Bachelet in Chile and amidst various corruption scandals. We have Peru worried about its own scandal involving its intelligence apparatus. We have President Peña Nieto somewhat consumed by a series of scandals involving Grupo Higa and others, certain properties in Valle del Bravo, etc. And without weighing in on the scandals, the issue is that these things have been a distraction to the more important national and regional issues of the progress that must be made in free trade. Now, having said that, ALBA and Argentina and Brazil have some of their own challenges. As I indicated here, it's a very different model that ALBA, Argentina, and Brazil are pursuing, protecting domestic interests, focusing on regulating, focusing on who gets the public contracts in a state-to-state sense, as much as to what degree do those benefit the society. And yet, recognizing that diversity of orientation, to me, having been for the past 12 years someone who closely follows Chinese engagement with the Americas, the irony to me is the state-to-state engagement puts those countries at their worst and puts China at its best in terms of what it does most effectively, which is the coordination of the apparatus of the state, its quasi-state financial system, and its quasi-state-owned companies. At the same time, what happens on the ALBA side is also highly uncertain. You have the ongoing implosion of Venezuela as it runs out of financial reserves and experiences other difficulties. You have questions as to what comes next, the transferability of the model in Bolivia to a broader regional model. Although President Correa in Ecuador has arguably done some very effective things in terms of building up his nation's infrastructure, he is, at least in some circles, rumored to not play well with others, and there's some question as to, thus, the degree to which an Ecuador-type model can lead ALBA. When one looks even at Nicaragua, we're in a critical moment with the Nicaraguan canal, approximately 6 months behind schedule and experiencing some serious challenges according to their own published schedule. The idea being that the geographic position of Nicaragua and the resources that could come from the canal could make the Nicaraguan voice a very important voice in understanding where the statist model goes in the Pacific. And yet at the same time, if Nicaragua and the canal project collapse, that also will have very significant implications for where we see ALBA go. Brazil goes without saying, the issues including questions of the possible calls for resignation of President Dilma Rousseff, as well as basically the future of the BRICS Bank, which would impose more of a China-funded model with respect to development, but essentially with the difficulties in Brazil right now, Brazil being out of money, and some of the other BRICS members, especially Russia, also experiencing problems. And so overall, we see significant uncertainty on both sides, let alone ideas such as, for example, what will be the future role of CELAC as a multilateral organization engaging across the Pacific as China wishes it to. The question of what will slowing growth in the PRC mean. And to me, the piece that's not often talked about in this context is that slowing growth in China potentially adversely impacts both the pro-free trade regime. Peru and Chile will be adversely impacted because of their dependence on commodity exports, and at the same time, Venezuela, Ecuador, and others will also be seriously impacted as well. And so, to me, the way that the slowing growth of China not only shakes out economically, but the way it shakes out politically is of significance. So, I wanted to conclude with a few recommendations, and I'll try to be brief with these. But clearly, one of the things that I personally believe that is a greater need for U.S. policymakers is to take more of an integrated trans-Pacific approach to our strategy. Too often we have a very effective Asia strategy team, whether in state or DoD and elsewhere, and a very effective Western Hemisphere team. But I believe we spend too little time thinking about how to integrate both sides of the Pacific as we formulate strategy towards those nations. Also, and I think our previous speakers already alluded to this, the importance of articulating values. And this, as Mr. McClarty suggested, really takes presidential leadership. In other words, to articulate why do we believe that free trade and the rule of law and these type of things bring greater prosperity and greater good for the peoples of our shared region. And doing that requires not only words, but also the use of examples, whether positive examples, nations such as Chile, who in adherence to strong institutions and free trade have achieved remarkable progress for their people, and negative examples, arguably, to be perfectly frank, the false promises of populism, of Bolivarian 20th century socialism, and the ways in which those types of exploitation by populist leaders of those false hopes have proven not to be the answer in creating prosperity. At the same time, whole of government. Making trade work requires effective trade institutions, it requires effective ports, it requires effective use of financial regulation, etc. These are ways in which U.S. capabilities in terms of whole of government approaches must work to help strengthen those institutions. We have a vested interest in making sure that free and effective trade work for our partner nations in the hemisphere, and I think we can work in whole of government approaches to make sure that they see the fruits of those free trade. More forcefully advocating the opening of APEC. Countries and key stakeholders and partners of the U.S., such as Colombia, have been quietly screaming for some time that they wish. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons for the close rapprochement that we've seen between Colombia and Russia, which to some degree threatens Colombia's strategic interests, is Colombia's hope that maybe Russia will support its position in the opening of APEC. We have a duty, I think, to push for a broader APEC. Export-Import Bank goes without saying, but I think as someone who is on the right side of the political spectrum, that this is an area where not everything that comes from government is necessarily bad, and we need to fight for these interests. I did say that. And also, we have things at the subnational level we can do. If you think about the quality of our educational institutions, the programs that we have, the connections that we have to help our Asian counterparts from Japan, from Korea, from other places, to understand and make contacts to do business in Latin America, as well as we in the United States have some of the best Asia studies, China studies programs there are, the capabilities of the United States to work with our Latin American counterparts to help them in constructive pro-trade, rule of law ways, establish business contacts with our Asian contacts through U.S. institutions. And finally, it's important not to leave China out of this, but rather in the sense of leaving a door open by which the type of rule of law regime we want to create is a rule of law regime which is open to China for that opportunity to prosper within a system of established rules. And there are ways that we can work together with China in terms of working together to have healthy trans-Pacific financial institutions, healthy and efficient transportation systems and custom clearances processes, even if we do not achieve agreement with China on the specific TPP issues, trade accounting, avoiding triangulation, avoiding things that come with expanded trade, such as illegitimate trade, trans-Pacific financial interactions and things like that. And to conclude, also it is important that as we fight on the Western Hemisphere side as much as we fight in Asia to build this new Trans-Pacific regime. One key element of that is we in the U.S. need to strengthen our position in our goodwill, in our faith as a good neighbor within Latin America. And I would argue that there are certain key things that we should see as part of the strategic picture that have to do with immigration and drug policy and other issues. Because in order for us to convince Latin America that we to work together to build this common rule of law regime, we also have to have the good faith of those Latin American countries. And in the end, we also need to make sure that the rule of law and a regime of free trade succeeds. If you recall, at the time in which we had the fall of the Berlin Wall, that wonderful moment that Francis Fukuyama, the historian, called the end of history. What we did not recognize at the time is that the end of history did not sell as gospel religion our partners in the region that the Washington Consensus was right. It gave us in the United States a golden opportunity that Latin Americans were willing to try out in a serious fashion through leaders from Fujimori in Peru to others, that model represented by the Washington Consensus. But in some ways, the failure that we had to ensure that Latin America succeeded and prospered through applying the Washington Consensus set up the conditions by which that began to unravel for us in recent years. And so as we move forward once again in the 21st century, what I would argue is we have a vested interest not just in convincing the nations to adopt this model, but ensuring that the free trade model and the rule of law model brings success and prosperity and equality. Because it's one advantage to convince nations to try it. It's equally critical to make sure that they realize and understand that prosperity in order for that regime that guarantees that prosperity to be enduring and create the type of century that we all wish to live in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Evan. That was a magnificent presentation. We're going to open up a period for questions and discussion. I would very much appreciate if those who want to contribute to this discussion, we provide them with a microphone. That's some of our people here go around with the microphone. And we ask you to please say your name and affiliation. And this is going to be a very interesting exchange this afternoon. Okay.
Shao Yangsha, a correspondent of Wenhui Daily, Shanghai, China. So I have a question about China. And earlier this month, President Obama said during an interview that he believes that China will eventually join the TPP. So the question is, what does it mean for the TPP if China joins the TPP, and what kind of role can China play within the TPP? And secondly, with the accession into the TPP of China, how will it change the picture of U.S.-China competition in the region and the general U.S.-China relations as well? Thank you very much.
I'll take first, and then when you. I'll take a quick first cut and then have Evan follow up with his comments, because he studied this issue in a depthful way. First of all, I am a strong and long-time believer in encouraging serious, sustained relations and partnerships and cooperation where possible with China. Our older son has actually lived and worked in China for the past 6 years, so we have a commitment there in a business sense as well as from a policy and political sense. I think both Armando and Evan in their comments, captured a good portion of China's interest and engagement in the region, and really how I think the TPP is exactly the right step to encourage China to continue to become more integrated and active throughout the world. President Clinton, in his last year in the administration, proving lame ducks can still fly, in his 8th year, was when China was brought into the World Trade Organization, which is really a pretty good predicate for the question you're asking. And that was done on a bipartisan basis here in our Congress, a much broader basis than the current discussions of TPP. I think also it will encourage China to raise their standards in terms of trade. It will make it consistent, more harmonious. And I think particularly of some of these issues that both Evan and Armando hit in terms of the rule of law, transparency, and so forth, I think all of that encourages China to move in the right direction and a much more responsible stakeholder, to use Bob Zellick's now very well-known term. Having said all of that, there's inevitably going to be a competition with China and the United States, particularly from an economic standpoint. And we have competition with other countries throughout the world, including our beloved neighbors to the north in Canada, who are actually very active in the region. So this is not unusual or unhealthy, it's just inevitable. But I think competition does not mean that you can have a natural cooperation and certainly a harmonious and level set playing field.
I have to agree, especially that the thing that Ms. Merclarty said is absolutely key. Competition is normal. Competition indeed can be good. We compete with Canada. We compete with many. Indeed, many of the improvements that we have in industry come from competition, and the issue is, what is the structure within which competition occurs? Is that structure a structure that produces benefits and progress, or is it a structure that brings out the worst of human nature and the possibility of conflict or something worse? And so to me, whether it's, and first of all, I think as we recognize, the U.S. has never tried to exclude China explicitly from the TPP, and I think some of the better voices that I've heard look wisely to a world in which we hope that China is either party to TPP or party to something similar. Because at the end of the day, the question becomes, how do we and China and other countries live together in this new Pacific century? And I think the key is we need to structure the inherent competition in a way that convinces that if there are gains and losses, that it is through an understood and fair process. And I think that is the best bet so that those efforts can produce prosperity for all involved. So I personally welcome an era in which we have China as a part of a broader trans-regional trade structure. And it will not be a world in which the institutions and their weights and rules are the same as they are today. China is shaking up the world, but I think they must be a rule of accepted, commonly understood rules and transparency.
On the matter of the rule of law, before CAFTA we had the Caribbean Basin Initiative. And many of the no people in our referendum would say, why do we need CAFTA if we already have this? Well, because CAFTA had it was basically, it had characteristics of being an aid program to some degree. It was unilateral. It was a series of trade benefits the U.S. gave us, and that could, at the same time, be revoked. So the argument for the yes was, well, the reason we should have CAFTA, one of the reasons, is the rule of law, because this will be an international treaty that will give us all the same rules to observe and to play by. With China, I think a similar situation would be a big improvement, because frankly, one of the things that worries some throughout the world, and I would say in Latin America specifically, in our relations with China, is that when you deal with Chinese companies, you're usually dealing with the Chinese state. if we have a conflict with the U.S. investment in Costa Rica, we have international laws that will help us solve that conflict, but we will be in conflict in a legal scenario with a U.S. company, not with the U.S. government. So clear laws, and it's quite a different thing. A clear set of laws, a clear framework, which is what these agreements can create, is a very positive thing, and also promotes trust in commercial relations.
Very good. There is a gentleman here. Yeah.
Brian Marshall. I'm semi-retired. And I recall at the time of the NAFTA negotiations, we knew a lot about various facets of the agreement as it was being in the process of being negotiated. That does not seem to be the case with the TPP at this time. Is that a correct impression, or and if so, can somebody possibly say why that might be the case and how you feel about it? Thank you.
I'll come in pitch to you. Yeah, we'll do the same one too. I'll make a couple of comments, and then Evan can follow up, and Armando. First of all, I think your question is a timely and thoughtful one. I think you are largely right, as I recall it. You'll remember on the NAFTA that it had been negotiated by the Bush 41 administration, a Republican administration, but not fully negotiated, but largely negotiated, and then it was passed to the Clinton administration to move it forward to get it ratified with the Congress. We actually had much more negotiation left than we anticipated, just because of the inevitable back and forth, and how you were going to finalize some of the agreement with members of Congress to get the votes. I think there was, therefore, because of that two-step, I think there was much more known about the agreement. One of the criticisms has been that this has been not as transparent or open agreement. That's really the point of your question. It's a fair one. I think Ambassador Froman would argue that he doesn't want to put everything out there as he's still negotiating the agreement with these countries around the world, and how do you do that without reaching final agreement? So there's understandable concerns. I think all of that can be squared up, if you will, when the Trans-Pacific Agreement comes to vote. It's going to be out there, and that's going to be the fierce battle that I noted. So I think there are some differences, but your questions, your concerns, your sensitivities, I think are very good. I think they can be accommodated at the end of the day, and I think they will be.
Absolutely. I mean, you have to keep in mind that this agreement actually started outside of the U.S. With the P4. It involves 12 parties, so in many ways it has been much more complex than NAFTA. And in many ways, we, in Washington at least, and of course, as we all know, nothing actually exists until Washington focuses on it. But we only have really recently began to focus on this agreement. And so exactly as Mr. McClarty said, I think that we will see. Especially, there is explicitly, I believe it's a 2-month provision, even after the agreement, in which I am confident that there will be, exhaustive opportunities. And of course, NAFTA is now far behind us, and we have not yet gotten to the point of that intersection with this agreement.
We're going to turn to the right wing here. Sir?
Hi, I'm Raj Boya, a DC resident. My question is to Mr. McClarty. Were there any unintended consequences that you could not foresee around the time NAFTA agreement took place? That's my first question. And my second question is, some opponents of these trade deals talk about potential job losses in this country. I would like to know what sectors you think would be impacted, and how many millions of jobs are we talking about, and what kind of assistance is going to be in place for them? Thank you.
I think to respond to your first question in terms of the consequences of NAFTA, what was anticipated and so forth, you know, hindsight's a great substitute for wisdom when you look back. And so there's always, I think, on any decision that any of us make, certain consequences that are likely to be different than we intended. I think Armando had it just right in his comments in terms of trade. I think if you look at the imperial data, it's pretty hard not to conclude that while the expectations may have been too high in NAFTA, that it has been a net job creator. But equally, you cannot, in all three countries, but equally you cannot conclude that there was certain dislocation in certain sectors, and therefore certain lives and families affected in a very negative way. And that's really where you have the basis there. There's some political factors and funding of campaigns that come into this as well. But that's the real human element in this trade debate that you're hearing now, and we heard on the NAFTA. But I think Evan's comments about a trade agreement being much more broad than just the economic side, and the TPP certainly fits in that category. But I would submit to you, without the North American Free Trade Agreement, I think that we would likely have not seen Mexico continue to advance as an outward-looking country and strengthen their democracy and rule of law and their economy. And if you think about the consequences of their not doing that on our southern border, given the size of Mexico, those are pretty potentially serious consequences. So it goes to your other point in terms of assistance to those that have lost their job due to trade, although the big driver of job loss, just think about it, all the journalists that are here, the big driver in terms of job loss and change is technology, not trade. That's what's changed the world. And so you do have a lot of creative destruction, much more so than you saw in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So I think part of that goes not just to trade adjustment assistance, but a much more holistic approach in terms of preparing people for having 2, 3, 4 different jobs in their lifetime and careers. That's very, very different. In terms of job loss and the sectors, that's really a much longer discussion probably than time will allow today, and it's a pretty specific question. But I think on balance, you have to think, as large as these Asian markets are. I mean, 96% of the world's commerce takes place outside the United States in terms of, or at least the market potential is in the 95, 96%. I think we've just got a much greater capacity to increase our exports to this region than jobs will be lost here. I did mention about energy, which makes us more competitive, but our export jobs are much better paying. So I think on balance, this will be an economic driver for our country and increased growth in jobs. But we've got to be very sensitive and mindful to jobs lost or dislocated, to trade or any other of the major drivers.
I see we go to the middle of the road now. Dr. Casas?
Thank you very much. Wonderful panel. I mean, it is much easier to make an argument in favor of free trade in general terms, in macro terms. But the fact is that there are, free trade agreements bring or may bring negative consequences for very specific people.
No question.
And we all know that. And therefore, the real question, one of the critical questions in this discussion is, to what extent are governments, in this case, the U.S. government, but also the Costa Rican government, because this was an issue that some of the more enlightened voices of the opposition to CAFTA brought up, when the discussion was raging. To what extent governments are willing to put in place robust programs to ameliorate some of those negative consequences, because the track record is not very good when it comes to that. And I think that some of them is trust that that pervades this discussion is frankly warranted.
Happily, yes. The dichotomy between the general good and the sacrifice of some specific interests, and therefore the consequences on a number of people can be illustrated by a debate we're having in Costa Rica just these days. Our government is protecting our avocado production, and I believe it is doing so by invoking sanitary legislation, which I think doesn't really apply. We're blocking out avocado exports through a non-tariff barrier. The reason this illustrates Mr. Casas's point, Dr. Casas's point, is that when you look at the statistics of our avocado market, you realize that our local production can only supply 16% of the demand. So that's how specific the interest group is that would advocate trade barriers to avocados, and that's how significant the broader society that is affected by scarcity and price is. So you have to balance out these interests, and yes, perhaps you do need to introduce government programs that can help the affected sectors adjust. Now, there are two things that one must take into consideration in this sense. One is that these trade agreements often provide for a gradual integration of different sectors into the free trade. So there is time to make the transition. Even so, there are sectors, groups that don't take advantage of those windows created by the treaties, and well, you can't stop the world to wait until they get off. And one final thing I would add is that I know that in the U.S. It's coming up for a vote these days, or I don't know if it was just voted. You have a program an adjustment program, right? I think in Costa Rica what we have failed at, Kevin, is a different thing. I think we've had a very successful transformation into an exporting country. Our export model, really, it is a miracle. It's been popular to speak of Chile as an economic miracle, but look at Costa Rica. We have no copper. We have no extraction industry, okay? We have none of that riches, and we have done pretty well as an exporter. Where we have failed, I think, Kevin, I don't know if you would agree with me, is in integrating more sectors of our society to that bonanza, okay? And that's where perhaps our excellent push into exports may have been much more successful had we integrated other sectors of our society into that effort and into its benefits.
Let me add just one thing, if I might, because I think it's important, and I think it's certainly appropriate to comment on this in the hallowed halls of the Hudson Institute with Ambassador Darrenblum. I think I'm a strong supporter of TAA, Trade Adjustment Assistance, and I think we need to be sensitive, mindful, going back to your question. But I would also underscore the real crucial point is to have growth in the economy that provides for good job opportunities. After the NAFTA was passed in the Clinton administration, which I'm obviously understandably proud of, but the facts are clear. The unemployment rate went from about 7% over time down to about 4%. People with welfare to work were moved out of poverty, and wages actually had a pretty strong growth during that period. So I think it's important as government targeted, efficiently run, hopefully, government programs are, growth in the economy, sound economic policy is absolutely crucial to, frankly, the well-being of all workers, middle class, in the entire country. So I just want to be sure we balance that out as we focus on government programs.
Yeah, and just very quickly, I mean, from a political perspective, one of the challenges is always that the losses in jobs due to an agreement, especially with the help of politicians in framing the issue, are often very concrete. You know, because of NAFTA, my factory moved to Mexico. But the benefits, very fewer people say, I have a job because of free trade. And I think in many ways, while dealing with things like TAA, as Mr. McCarty suggested, whether it's Costa Rica or elsewhere, it's also incumbent on politicians and others thinking strategically to sell the message of those overall benefits so that they can be perceived by those in the society who are not, PhD economists.
Very good. We continue on the middle road here.
Thanks, Patrick Wilson, and I work for Osage Global. My question is actually, why do you think there's so much focus on process? I mean, I've been sitting here listening to the conversation. It's all about process. You look back at past trade agreements, whether it was the Australia FTA or the Korea, right, two of the most recent that have passed, they've been overwhelming successes. In fact, it's an embarrassment for the Australian government that everyone's talking about what a terrible deal the Australians made and how America is winning all the fights. Right? Why aren't we talking more about that, about those examples? And if you look at, again, the economists who've looked at the Korea FTA also say it's an unmitigated success for American exporters, for high technology, for everything. Why aren't we talking about that?
I mean, I guess two quick answers. I mean, one is process is how you get to the agreement. Now, having said that, my understanding is that really the positive of TPP is the vast majority of technical issues really have probably been done. I mean, we're down to apparently some of the harder issues where senior leaders probably need to get together and play poker. But I think your second point is also very important, which is the use of concrete examples to sell what can be achieved and what the benefits are. Because I mean, I think our minds are wired that way. Concrete examples are what help us to understand why we should move beyond our fears, as Armando, and embrace something that could bring a positive.
Yeah, I think number one, the proponents of TPP need to get you involved and let you give your comments. Those are pretty compelling and pretty persuasive, and I think they're largely right on point. There's a reason that the phrase "sausage being made in the Congress" is a pretty familiar phrase. It does have a legislative process. That's really how you get to how you get to the end goal. Thank you. So I think that's pretty normal. This one has been a little more complicated than most. I would have to admit, but that's really how the legislative process works, and I think that's just inevitable. I do think, though, that Evan made a very good point in terms of this trade agreement, as in all trade agreements, as I tried to note in speaking about the NAFTA, for example. But I do think the security issue and the U.S. leadership around the world has resonated with the Congress, and kind of going back to the message level, that then you have to get out in the process to get it passed. But I think those have been compelling and persuasive arguments put forward.
Okay. We're open for business here. At the end, the gentleman at the end of the...
Thank you. My name is Kakumi Kobayashi with the Kyodo News of Japan, and I would like to ask you, Mr. McCarthy and any others in the panel, of the prospect of the TPP remaining part of the TPP negotiations. As you said, a lot of things happened in Congress in the past weeks, and that makes me suspect some TPP partners, or many of them, may have come to think the domestic support of President Obama or his political influence was not strong as we thought earlier, or not stable as we saw. So do you think these kind of situations, how do you think these kind of circumstances affect the last stage of the TPP negotiations? Or in other words, do you have any concerns it might take longer than before the conclusion? Thank you.
It's a good question. I think the momentum is with the administration on TPP as TPA passes, as it goes forward with TAA. I think there's still some battles ahead, as I noted, but you know, this is really part of any working democracy. You're going to have these different points of view and hopefully get to the right answer. That's the hallmarks of any working democracy. But I think at the moment, the way this is played out, it has strengthened the president's leadership at the moment around the world with not only the participants in TPP, but much more broadly.
I would just to add to that, I think one of the things that we can recognize now is that as we move beyond the political stage, presuming that President Obama signs the bill, really some of the next technical work passes into the hands of his trade team. And so in many ways that makes at least the coming stage, that the specific issue of his leadership a little bit less of a point of emphasis. Now, having said that, one of the things that concerns me a bit is, depending on the timing of how long it takes to finalize these negotiations, we may be getting into the evaluation period and the final vote very close to U.S. presidential elections, which obviously could be a concern. But from a Japanese perspective, one of my hopes is that now that we have essentially the message that the Republicans and some Democrats are behind the president, and there is the authority to go forward, that this will give us the leverage to work with, for example, your government, to get over some of the concerns regarding agriculture and the auto industry, et cetera, to basically bring, because I think from a security standpoint, it is in the United States' strategic interests to work with Japan and other like-minded countries to come to an agreed-upon set of rules. And so my hope is that this political message allows us to get beyond these issues to work those details out.
One last question.
Most Mosques, Blue Star Strategies. My question is going back to Latin America. Mr. Gonzalez, you talked a little bit about at the beginning about Costa Rica's labor laws and how you have very, very strong labor laws. But for specifically other Latin American countries, I lived in Peru for about a year, who don't have necessarily the intellectual property laws or the labor laws or the environmental regulations in place. Is the TPP going to address that in those countries? And if so, are there going to be enforcement regulations in place within the regime, or is that kind of completely still off the table at this point? Thank you.
It has been said that there is the intention to make the TPP a higher standard agreement in these matters. Central America is at the moment not participating in the negotiations. The agreement is being negotiated with a model that will be open. It will allow other countries to join. So if in effect the good intentions of elevating labor and environmental practices also through the agreement are in effect successful, these intentions, well, eventually, if Central American countries decide to join, they will have to bring up their standards. There are already beneficial effects, I believe, of CAFTA, and I do understand that in our region there is much to be done in these matters, right? Because yes, not all countries are up to Costa Rican standards, which are quite high.
If I could just make one comment, although there's a wide disparity between labor laws, not all Latin American countries have bad labor laws. Oftentimes, one of the difficulties is whether they enforce those labor laws or not. I mean, my wife is Colombian. I can tell you that Colombia has some really good labor laws. But that also raises another possible follow-on for the United States in that working in an interagency context, one of the ways that we can engage and benefit our partners is to help strengthen institutions to work towards this common benefit.
Yes, one last thing. We have good laws and we enforce them in Costa Rica. But Evan has made a very good point. One of the reasons to an argument in favor of these agreements is precisely that labor laws and respect for labor rights have to do with leveling the playing field, which affects trade. So every country has an interest in making sure that the playing field is as level as possible, and the beneficial influence of trade partners who have more respect for labor and environment will be spread out throughout the whole partnership. So that is an argument for free trade, not against, as it has been tried to be turned.
Very good. We thank you very much for having joined us this afternoon, and I thank very much our brilliant speakers team we had here. And why don't we recognize that with a final round of applause?